Hello everyone, and welcome to the 109th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Frank Costello from The Departed. Based on the notorious James Whitey Bulger of Boston's infamous Winter Hill Gang, Frank Costello is a devious, brutal, and repugnant character who dominates the world he lives in via brute force, cunning, and expert plotting. A man whose strong will and arrogance leads many a young man down the path of evil so he might acquire the money and power that he craves. In this video, we're going to explore not just all there is to know about Frank, but the men that he created as well, examining just what horrors a man can sow when he makes his environment a product of himself, as Frank so eloquently states at the beginning of this film. Now, though Frank is based on Whitey, we won't be using any information about Whitey in this video, and there are two reasons for this. The first is because Frank being based on Whitey doesn't mean that he's a direct representation of Whitey. And while they do share similarities in their personalities and the way in which they conducted their business, the events of this film are entirely fictional and have no connection to Whitey whatsoever. And the second reason ties into the first, that being that I will be making a video on Whitey at some point in the near or distant future, so tying in the real man to a false replication of him wouldn't really be doing us any favors here. If you would like to use the future episode on Whitey as a source of information to better understand how Frank became Frank, I'll refer back to this episode in that video when it's released. And if you'd like to see an episode on Whitey sooner rather than later, feel free to let me know down below. Now, criminals like Frank certainly still exist in this world, but something that's much closer to home for the majority of us are the criminals who abuse our data for their own personal gain. And that's where our sponsor for this video, Incogni, comes into play. Incogni is a service that automatically detects when your data has been breached by data brokers that seek to sell your personal information to unknown businesses for their own benefit. Have you ever had a week where you're getting persistent phone calls regarding your car's extended warranty? Or worse still, received a shady email that contains way more personal information than some unknown person on the internet should know? Well, chances are that's because your data has been breached by data brokers. I know mine certainly has, as those examples I just mentioned are unfortunately quite prevalent in my life. I get more spam emails than I know what to do with. And I seem to be the victim of a rotating schedule of different scam calls. And it was easy to see why once I used Incogni, which within the first 10 seconds after signing up, identified a whopping 101 data breaches under my name. Near instantly, Incogni dealt with 3 of those breaches, and it's just a matter of time before all of them are taken care of, and that's with little effort on my part. And thank goodness for that, because dealing with 101 different malicious companies on my own sounds like something that, well, I would probably never do. You too can see how your data is being misused today and get it taken care of effortlessly by going to incogni.com/viali, where the first 100 people to sign up will get a 20% discount off their incredible service with the promo code VIALI. And if you aren't satisfied with what they have to offer, you can try it risk-free for 30 days and get a full refund if you aren't happy with them. So give Incogni a shot today and start saving yourself from more than a few internet-related headaches. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this video. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The very first scene of the film tells us a lot about what kind of a man Frank Costello is. Set during the time of Colin's youth, we find a man who is confident, facetious, and commanding. Entering Vin's park luncheonette to collect his take, Frank scolds Vin for making him come down to his store to receive his meager payout. And after doing so, Frank proceeds to intimidate him in one of the most disgusting ways possible by not so subtly targeting his daughter, commenting on how she's developing into a fine young woman, and then asking her whether or not she's gotten her period yet. Frank is showing Vin in so many words that he essentially owns everything he has, right down to his children, and that if he doesn't toe the Frank Costello line, there's a very real possibility that something horrible could wind up happening to his daughter. And as we can plainly see on Vin's face, he's powerless to stop him should that happen. Though this is horrible, and Frank tops it off with some more misogyny when he tells Carmen to keep the change from his transaction so she can buy herself some makeup, the real tragedy here is Frank's grooming of Colin Sullivan. Familiar with Colin through his father, who may or may not have worked for him, Frank sparks a conversation with Colin, wherein he spoils him with gifts aplenty, taken straight from one of the vassals of his kingdom, plying him with food, treats, and comic books in a show of royal goodwill to this young scion of South Boston. And after Frank has flexed his muscles and displayed his goodwill, he inquires about his education, and pleased with Colin's answer that he does well in school, Frank tells Colin to come and find him on L Street if he'd ever like to earn a little extra money, after which Colin leaves the establishment with a knowing Frank looking on after him. Now, I talked about this at length in a recent video, but what Frank has just done here is provide Colin with a role model that's so intimately close to his world that whoever his idols may have been prior to this moment might as well have never existed, as right before his eyes, he saw one man come into another man's business, take his hard-earned money, and threaten his daughter to command respect. And then he proceeded to shower him with gifts taken from this man's store in a show of both force and charity, turning Frank, in Colin's mind, into a sort of neighborhood superhero that he could be like someday if he so desired. Now, with this setup, we're given some insight into Frank's overall ideology, as intermixed with his grooming are a few lessons given to Colin and a few other boys that Frank has enticed with his bravado at his shop on L Street. Frank regales these boys with tales of his escapades, the perils of becoming a servant to the church, and the history of their fair city, and how he, unlike black people, who he of course despises, just like any good old-school Irish Bostonian would, has taken what he's earned because nobody gives it to you, and that when it comes down to it, there isn't much of a difference between himself and a policeman when you're facing a loaded gun. Fast forward 15 years more or less, and we have a Colin Sullivan, among others, living the life of both the cop and the criminal, but we'll get back to them in just a moment. For now, let's look more into Frank and the people who surround him. As we saw in this opening scene, when Frank is explaining to his students that the Italians down in Providence tried to tell him what to do, he and his associates took care of them in quite the brutal fashion. And we're given an example of one such occasion where Frank executes a man in who we can assume to be his wife, alongside Mr. French. And here we're treated to just how much of a sick and twisted sadist Frank is when he remarks that the wife fell funny, having a good laugh about it afterwards, to which French appropriately remarks that Frank should really see somebody. However, though French doesn't show himself to be quite as sadistic as his boss, and even seems to be somewhat concerned with Frank's sadism, there's no denying that he's in need of some help as well. Stone-faced and merciless, French is a cold-blooded killer who, as we see by his interaction with Frank here, doesn't exactly revel in murder, but he will kill someone at the drop of a dime without a second thought put to the matter, as we can see when he and Bill go to see Brian, and he murders him the moment after he calmly assured him that he wasn't going to hurt him, going about his deadly business afterwards, as if nothing at all had happened just a moment ago. Fitzy, Delahunt, and the other unnamed cronies operating under Frank are all probably of similar dispositions, and if Frank has made his environment a product of himself as he claims, we can certainly see that playing out in the way the men associated with him conduct themselves, that is to say, quite brutally. Just as the initial sadism we're treated to from Frank can be used as an example of how and why these men developed into who they are under his tutelage, there's ever more casual violence on Frank's part that's presented to us in this film that solidifies how Frank is a disease who infects those around him, like his half-serious, half-jovial attitude towards Bill's screw-up when he tunes up two guys from the Providence Mafia, his handling of a severed hand as if it were a prop taken from a mannequin, one that he removes the wedding ring from in order to send it to the man's wife to give her some comfort. But at least he inquired which hand the man jerked off with before choosing which one to sever, which was very courteous of him indeed. And of course, the scene where Frank is coated in blood at his restaurant after one of his guys answered the questions as to whether or not he was a rat wrong, where we see Frank treating the cleanup of this murder like a bit of spilled milk. But perhaps the two greatest traits Frank has that contributes to his success in his dark business are his amiability and force of will. Tying into how casual he handles violence, Frank is an incredibly likable man, one that is able to converse with people in situations both macabre and mundane with a smile on his face and a lax, humorous demeanor that serves to put people at ease while also bolstering his aforementioned force of will. His sense of humor is both crass and perverted, as we can see when he's chastising two Catholic priests for either their own sexual misconduct or the churches in general, while he remarks on his previous relationship with one of their nuns, and also when he shakes up Colin during their meetup at a porno theater by pretending to be one of its avid patrons, a performance that's complete with a sizable prosthetic prop. Even when Frank is faced with a dangerous and slightly disadvantageous situation, such as the one he finds himself in during his deal with the Chinese, we have a man who's unwavering, defiant, and crude, almost to the point of being stupid. But that's the thing about Frank. Even though he's a man who's clearly an egotist, he is quite intelligent, and the fact that he's managed to elude capture through careful use of his resources, namely his merciless attitude towards his competitors, and his willingness to utilize unscrupulous tactics via law enforcement, and his status as an FBI informant, is a testament to that. An interesting aspect of Frank is his apparent acknowledgement that the world he inhabits and the people it creates aren't exactly the greatest thing, as when he's having lunch with Billy towards the middle of the film, he remarks how both his father and his Uncle Jackie would have done anything to ensure that Frank was punished for associating with Bill if they had seen it happen, and then he proceeds to chastise Bill for dismissing his suggestion that he should go back to school, disappointed in the regression of this young man into something lesser than he could be. This speaks to just how intelligent Frank is, as you often find criminals and gangsters who operate as he does being depicted as simple representations of brutality and cruelty. But Frank understands that the people who have the talent to make something of themselves shouldn't debase themselves by becoming criminals, but rather unlock their potential and contribute to society. However, by far the most despicable thing that Frank accomplishes with his intelligence is something that we've already touched on a bit, using his keen understanding of human nature and his talents as a manipulator to groom children into his organization. Now, we're presented often with the differences and similarities between Colin and Bill throughout this film, and why they're both similar and different can be boiled down to their respective upbringings. Both grew up in South Boston, and both were exposed to members of the Costello organization through either direct contact or family members. However, the most influential people in their lives, Frank and Bill Costigan Sr., handled the environment that these children grew up in much different ways. Whereas Frank took Colin and used what we can assume to be his family's lax attitude towards his involvement with Frank to mold him into a tool that he could use to further his nefarious aims. Bill was partly raised by his father, a man who made sure to distance himself from the detrimental aspects of his environment and ensured that his son did the same, resulting in two boys who took nearly identical paths, but who walked in different directions. So with that in mind, Frank is all but the worst kind of hypocrite, as Colin, as well as the other boys that he trained to be extensions of himself, had just as much, or perhaps even more of a chance at furthering their educations and leading productive lives outside Frank's reach. So while it is interesting that Frank has this attitude towards Bill's education, it's laughable that he does, considering that he's ruined who knows how many other people without much thought put to the matter. And that's the thing about Frank. Even though we're given rare moments where he shows himself to be concerned with his fellow man, at the end of the day, everything that he does is for himself, and the people he claims to care for on either a personal or philosophical level don't really matter all too much to Frank, as he would murder them or give them up to the FBI without any hesitation if it meant that he felt threatened by them or that he could benefit in some way from putting them out of action. But no matter how efficient Frank is at dealing with his enemies, no matter how smart he is when organizing his business dealings, he still harbors within him the greatest downfalls of a man in his position: an immense ego, overwhelming greed, and extreme paranoia. Frank has acted throughout this entire film as a king without reproach, a man who needs not suffer the thoughts and opinions of others around him, but one who can do as he pleases when he pleases. And his idea that he is the smartest and greatest gangster who ever set foot in Boston does help keep his organization hierarchical and firmly within his grasp, but it also sets him apart from those around him personally and mentally, as though his underlings might have ideas of their own on how they can better assist their boss and his business. Their opinions on anything that Frank does are hardly ever taken into account and are instead overwritten by his divine authority, even when it's detrimental. His greed is an extension of his ego, and his self-admission that he no longer requires money or even women shows us how Frank is a man so deeply ingrained in both the allure of power and his own vices that he's willing to continue endangering himself and the men around him simply to keep the idea that Frank Costello is the man alive and well, even if it kills him. His paranoia serves to turn his fellow man against him as well, as though it's assisted him greatly. Frank has created an environment of fear that undoubtedly heightens his crew's uneasiness towards and mistrust of their boss. And as Bill claims when he's being grilled by Frank at his restaurant, one of his men would have eventually popped Frank if the cops hadn't beaten them to it, as an old volatile man, quivering in his boots at the first sign of any law-related shadows, was always doomed to suffer an end that all criminals of his caliber suffer: death by compatriot, death by cop, death by the chair, or life in prison. But in the end, it's death by a combination cop and criminal, gunned down and betrayed by the man he had raised to be one of his most valuable tools for being the very thing that he claimed to despise more than anything else: a rat, the Rat King, eaten alive by his subjects. And at this end, who was Frank Costello? He was a man who seized control of the Boston criminal underworld through a combination of willpower, intelligence, manipulation, cunning, and brute force. Cruel, sadistic, and merciless, Frank did what he set out to do. He made his environment a product of himself. The Dark Father raising a group of people to become members of his twisted family, a family that dealt in misery, strife, and death, all for the benefit of one man, a man who would sooner see them dead or locked up if they tried to disrupt any aspect of his pleasure or power. Though Frank and the men working for him ended countless lives and caused countless more to suffer, he did ultimately get what he deserved. However, his destruction of the lives he abused when committing his crimes were not the only victims here, as the men who served under him were as well. Boys lured in by the promise of wealth and power, who suffered the same fate as their benefactor at the climax of his life and beyond. A man whose contribution to society can be found solely in the realm of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Frank? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, to my patrons, and to anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and Reddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.